Test. I want to fuck this up again. Hi there, Plebeian viewers. It's been a while. Welcome back to Crit Day, your third favorite show on the internet. Today's episode is brought to you by my broken office chair, which, if you haven't noticed, I'm sitting way lower to the ground. First of all, I'd like to ask, how's everybody's quarantine going? Personally, I have been online shopping like a psychopath. I have like $250 worth of craft coffee in my fridge. So if you're like me at all, you've been watching TV like a lunatic during these times, and I've been crushing a lot of different dramas. Been really feeling that vibe lately. The reason I like the miniseries format is because you can really cram in those details that might not make it into the window of, say, a 2-hour movie. A great example of this is the Tom Hardy movie Legend. Personally, I love this movie strictly because I'm a big Tom Hardy fan. But if you're looking at it as a non-Tom Hardy fan or looking for a good depiction of the Cray twins, it doesn't really do that. And the movie's still 2 fucking hours long. So it's like, how much more could they have crammed in? In that regard, the movie just kind of failed. So if it weren't for Tom Hardy's performance, that movie would probably suck. So this brings me to today's topic, which is the show Waco, which just came to Netflix and that I watched over a period of 2 days. It's a 6-part miniseries, originally aired on the Paramount Network, and as I said, recently added to Netflix. I like this show. It kept my attention all the way through. Characters and dialogue are written well. The narratives that are going parallel to one another are really interesting. Well, all but one. And we'll get to that. So before we move on, since I'm going to be talking about shows, I guess I better put on my show reviewer hat. Much better. Now I can talk about shows. So I won't go too heavily into the history of what this show was covering, because that's a whole nother tangent in and of itself. But in short, it was a series covering the 51-day ATF and FBI siege of the Branch Davidians' Mount Carmel compound just outside of Waco, Texas. So as I was watching this show, I noticed a couple things, and I immediately thought, like, I want to talk about this on some platform other than just texting my friends who haven't watched the show and just complaining about what I'm going to complain about. And the big thing that bothered me throughout the show, and this is something that happens in almost all dramas, was the forced love narrative. I don't know what it is about every drama that has to just take compelling narrative and then smash it with a love narrative. Especially something like this, where it's actual events and actual compelling events. A love narrative just isn't necessary. And in the way that they did it in this show, it just doesn't fit. It feels forced. It's just like taking this interesting ball and then just trying to mash the fucking unnecessary narrative in it, and it crushes a lot of good things. So I'm going to list off some of the narratives that occurred in the show that were really compelling and that I wrote down. Spoilers, obviously. So compelling narratives that were inserted. The connection of the mothers. David Thibodeau's mother as a character in general. She was pivotal to the story. The troubles of men that basically gave up their wives to this lunatic. If you haven't watched the show or don't know much about it, David Koresh, who was the leader of the Branch Davidians at the time, he took on the burden of sex. So he just got to have a bunch of wives and do all the sex for all the men at the compound, and a couple of them came there with their wives, and then this dude's plowing their wife and having kids with them. So that's fucked. David Koresh building the trust and swaying the judgment of the ATF agent. The fuck happened to that guy? He seems like he's going to be a huge deal, and then tensions come to a head and he vanishes. Again, if you haven't watched the show, one of the things that the ATF does prior to their main siege is send in this guy to gather intel, and David Koresh starts to sway him on what this, we'll call it cult, may be, and then the siege happens, the FBI takes over, it kind of seems like this dude's going to be an important character, and then you just never see him again. The entire idea that perhaps, while seen as a wild cult, and while the outside world may not agree with their methods, the Branch Davidians weren't doing anything wrong, or at the very least, what they were doing, which was stockpiling illegal weapons, didn't warrant the response. So these are the narratives that were inserted into the story and obviously beefed up to make it more exciting and to heighten the drama. And the compelling narratives that actually came from this event were the entire thing. It's one of the things about dramatizing an event that not only actually happened, but is so heavily publicized, is that you don't really need to insert things that didn't happen, or at least beef up things that didn't happen because you think they need to be there. So the biggest unnecessary element was that they thrust this unnecessary love story between David Thibodeau, who's played by Macaulay Culkin's brother. When the guy first pops on the screen, you're immediately like, "What? This dude looks familiar," but you don't know why. And then you see him next to his brother after you Google who plays him, and you're like, "Oh shit! All those Culkins look super similar," which is crazy. But they thrust a love narrative between him and one of Koresh's wives, who he married when she was like 12, which is one of the big things that the ATF thought they had when they were breaching the Davidians' compound. And it's just like a pandering, lame, spoon-fed love narrative. You know, the room clears out, and they're kind of like, "Oh, and what are we doing here?" You know, they're each questioning why they're there within one another, but they're both questioning why they're there as is. The girl was forced to marry this dude when she was 12, and David Thibodeau was a person who was convinced by David Koresh to come to the compound after filling in for his band. And one of the biggest things that like bothers me about this side narrative is like, okay, if you're going to thrust a love narrative in, a lot of dramas want to and think they need to, and people identify with that. But the girl just isn't a strong enough actress, in my opinion, to carry that narrative on its own. Like, if it's not a main plot line, then the characters who are a part of it really, really need to give it some merit, because otherwise, like, why is it there? If you've watched the show, you may be saying like, "Oh, well, the love narrative gives relevance to the depth of Thibodeau's character," but it doesn't. Every element of David Thibodeau's character that is exciting would still be exciting without this love narrative. Thibodeau's presence, most notably his introduction, represents how persuasive and charming David Koresh is. So the fact that he's even being there shows how, we'll call it manipulative, this cult leader is and was. And his continued confusion on whether or not he should stay furthers that plot line, because every time he starts to question it, Koresh is like, "You know, we don't take visitors. You know, if you're here, you're here." And he kind of wants to stay. And again, the love narrative kind of makes him maybe want to stay, but once things carry on, the back and forth between he and his mother becomes a really compelling narrative. And again, it's just something that furthers the depth of this character without needing this girl who loves him. You've got this incredibly doubtful mother of what's going on, and you've got the persuasive cult leader. This push and pull between these two, combined with a well-written and well-acted character, is all you really need to make the character compelling. So when you thrust that he's in love with this child because she's still like 16, it's not necessary or relevant to making this character deeper. It's just there to be there. But staying on the theme of why this doesn't need to happen, his mother then becomes an extremely major character as she introduces us to Koresh's mother. And her interaction with the outside world just really starts to introduce another side. That's one thing that this show does really well. You've got a view of every single side of this story. You've got inside the compound with the Branch Davidians. You've got the ATF for a short time, then the FBI when they take over. You've got the media. You've got the public, both sympathizers and people who think you should be getting in there. So it does a great job in showing sort of all characters at play here. The mother also further humanizes Gary, who I haven't really mentioned, but is the FBI lead negotiator, played by Michael Shannon, played incredibly. Huge Michael Shannon fan. He does an awesome job. I was going to get into that later. But she not only introduces another side, but Thibodeau's mother connects all of the sides as she interacts with the media. She gets in the face of the FBI. She gets to Korish's mother. I mean, she is the link to a lot of things. I think this is a underappreciated character in this show, but she did an awesome job. Perfect example of where and why the love narrative is unnecessary. So there's a scene where the Davidians are watching TV and they're kind of flipping through the channels. They're constantly looking at all the media coverage of what's going on. And as they flip past a channel, Thibodeau notices his mother is being interviewed. He has them go back. She's giving this emotional monologue about, she wants to know that he's safe and she wants him to come out and blah, blah, blah. And the emotion jars Tibbs and further sprouts the seed of doubt that's probably existed since he got there. This scene is brilliant because it really emphasizes the doubt. It shows a connection that we might not have thought Thibodeau had, and it shows how frustrated Korish gets when his followers doubt him. But then it ends with what's her name standing up and like quietly holding Thibodeau's hand, and it's just like a eye roll of a scene. Everything was good. It told so much of the story, and then it's just like, oh, also, if you didn't notice, he's falling in love with this girl, but he's really not. So what is this really doing? Is this meant to further the doubt of David Koresh going on through the group? Well, Steve, his right-hand man, his entire plot line is doing that way better. The entire show. And it's centralized, so, okay, that job's being done. Add depth to Tibbs? Tibbs is arguably the deepest written character in the whole show, and I strongly believe that he'd be just as deep without this narrative. I'll give them this. There's potential in that one of David's wives manipulated into marriage and motherhood at an extremely young age, falling in love with a new outsider, could have really collapsed the idea of the Branch Davidians. But it's not pushed enough, because there's real events and far more compelling narratives that they've decided to push harder. If they had said, fuck it, and pushed the dramatization and really gone after this love narrative, it could have been something that was way more interesting if it was central to the plot. But as a side narrative, the girl doesn't carry the strength to just act this scene. Thibodeau is deep enough, so he doesn't need another layer, and it's just forced in so many scenes. It's just a spoon-fed and pandering narrative that does not need to be there. And drama shows can learn, especially when depicting real events, that you don't need a love narrative if it wasn't there. Stop trying to insert it. And so, I've got to say, and before people shit on me for this, I did my research post-show. I wrote out a whole script for this, and then I really started researching about it. It turns out David Thibodeau is an actual person and survivor of the Waco siege. Not only that, but the girl was real, and like in the show, Thibodeau was convinced to marry one of Korish's wives to give him legal help of potential statutory charges. However, there was no ceremony. They didn't play it up in real life. They kind of just signed some papers behind closed doors to give him that protection, and that was that. Had they done that to add to the layer of Korish trying to protect himself, then yeah, they could have easily just glossed over that in the show. But especially considering that David Thibodeau was a person who was on scene trying to make this show as real as possible, or cover as many things as they wanted to be real as possible, then why? This seems like the strong arm love narrative that's just inserted for the sake of being inserted. And even if a person's like, oh yeah, like they had me marry her, but, it wasn't like a big deal. And they're like, well, we can push that. We can make it a big deal. Overall, I think it could have been portrayed really subtly, or if they had decided to push it further, that it could have been more exciting, but the love narrative just didn't need to be there. Fun fact, however, I will say, if you do watch the show, the actual David Thibodeau has a cameo at the end when Gary, played by Michael Shannon, again, I'm going to say that because Michael Shannon fucking crushed it in this show, when he goes to the hearing and he's walking in after he goes through security, there's a thicker guy with gray hair sitting on the bench behind him. That's David Thibodeau. Thought that was pretty cool. So I wanted to also say some missed opportunities that the show had. While it's understood that the show is based on a book and the tale is quite long, there's quite a bit of context that, in my opinion, is missing about the Branch Davidians. The cult was founded 40 years before the siege actually happened, and they had an equally as charismatic leader who founded it, and he had this whole back and forth with David Koresh. He ended up killing a guy who stood out to him after David Koresh initially stood out to him. He went to an insane asylum, and then Koresh came back and took over. So it's just that when depicting reality, even when dramatizing it, it's unsafe to assume the audience just knows what's going on. And I think that's what they kind of did here. They jump right into it without a whole lot of context. I think what that does is allow you to feel more sympathy with David Koresh and the Branch Davidians, which I think you need when depicting a cult story like this, because if you make them seem too crazy, then I think the viewer could quickly be like, yeah, fuck them, like, get in there and shoot them. You know what I mean? But it's just unsafe to assume that we're going to know, especially when the events are 25 years old. If you're going to spoon feed the audience stories like you did this side love narrative, why not spoon feed us some context that makes us further understand the Branch Davidians? Even in what they kind of told us, they don't give a lot of information about the cult. So it's just little question marks like these. Like, why not tell us more about what this cult was? Why spoon feed us this crappy love narrative that doesn't really need to be there? It sounds like I'm knocking this show, but I promise I'm not. It's a solid show, and there's far more reasons than not to check it out. As I said earlier, Michael Shannon, who plays the lead FBI negotiator, is incredible, as he usually is. The character developments and the dynamics, for the most part, is solid, especially with the FBI, as they show and reference multiple high-level cases. This is the type of context that I'm talking about that would have been good with the Branch Davidians. There's so much depth and layers and backstory and context to the FBI and the way they portray it that it really presents all the information in the back and forth between negotiation and tactical in a way that is awesome. Another, I think, underappreciated character in this show is the radio guy. It was like a religious radio show in the Texas area, and this guy does interviews and he sympathizes with the Davidians, and he lays out context of what's wrong about what the FBI and ATF are doing at the time, and it's just like a really, really subtle layer that adds a lot of the context and other messages that we need. For example, at one point he has a religious scholar on, and they talk about how the definition of a cult is assigned by people outside of the cult. Nobody who's in a cult really thinks they're in a cult. That's just how it goes. And it's something that you don't really think about when you look at a depiction of this. You tend to think of people who are inside that building as like, oh, these are crazy cult members. But they don't think that. They think they're part of some otherworldly religious group following the next prophet. And I mentioned too, sympathy. This show does a really good job at displaying Koresh in a multi-tiered way and keeping us level. As I said, if the show were to really depict him as a psycho the whole time, then it would be easy to be like, fuck this guy, the FBI should get in there and arrest him. But since they garner sympathy, and at times they show him as a loving person and leader and maybe even prophet, they combat that excellently with times where they make him seem crazy. So they garner sympathy, they knock it down. It's a good depiction of a compelling leader. This show overall is awesome. I feel bad because I'm looking at my notes, and I think I wrote this before I actually finished the show, and I said 7.5 out of 10. I'm jumping that up to a solid 8.2. I'm just using this show as an example because it's a really good show, but it does the thing that a lot of good dramas do, and that's thrust a love narrative in that doesn't need to be there. And it's like, why? Why are we, especially when we're depicting real events, you don't need to add this narrative that you think people are going to understand. We can understand and be excited by dramatic events without a love story. It's lazy. It doesn't need to be there. If it's to the point where I think a drama show is more exciting, regardless of how good it is, if they don't add a fucking love narrative. As I said, 8.2. Pop out of my show reviewer hat now. Thank you so much for watching this very different episode of Crit Day. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you do check out the show Waco. Once you watch it and you've reviewed what I thought, comment and let me know if you agreed with me or if you think I'm a total idiot. If you'd like to follow along with what I've got going on and stay hopefully entertained during quarantine, you can follow me on Instagram at Forrest Hines Art. I've been posting a lot of new work. I have also been going live relatively frequently. I've just started a pretty big project, and we're around the midpoint of it, so definitely going to be going live the next couple days to try and entertain you and myself while I do it. For all things Plebeian, be sure to go to the home of it all, www.plebeian.us. We've got a bunch of new contributors who are just starting to fire away. Our new contributor, Thibodeau, just fired off their first documentary review. It's pretty cool. I just shared a really emotional, kind of long essay last week that is paired with 4 paintings that I did a couple months ago. It was the first time I shared them, and as I said, it was a pretty in-depth, kind of sad read, but it means a lot to me, so if you would check that out, that'd be awesome. The link is in my Instagram bio, so you can go follow me and find that easily. Be sure to follow Plebeian on Instagram at plebeian.mag. Like us on Facebook, Plebeian Inc. Follow us on Twitter at Plebeian Deli. Of course, subscribe to the YouTube. We've got all sorts of shit. We've also got a podcast highlight dropping today. That being said, be sure to listen to the Plebeian podcast as well as River of Consciousness. I mean, we've got so much content for you, so you can stay entertained all the time. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.